to be with her family when she was alone. Another person that is important was Rudy Umland, and I knew Rudy. He was the fellow who was the head of the WPA's Nebraska Writers Project. Rudy's a lot of Rudy's materials are in the Heritage Room. Sadly, the rest of the Rudy's materials should have come here, but they went to the Historical Society, and I couldn't get that stopped. But Rudy was a good fellow, and he, in his latter days, he was not at all well, and his wife wouldn't let any of his friends come see him. But Rudy was lonesome, and he'd make phone calls, and so I had several phone calls when I had extensive conversations with Rudy when he was trying to escape the notice of his wife. Gail Christensen bonded considerably with Rudy Umland, and we'll talk about Gail Christensen later, but he's the one that wrote the biography. Another interesting one that I knew was Dorothy Mead. And Dorothy Mead was the daughter of Irwin Barbour. Of course, Barbour was the director of the State Museum. And Dorothy was really interesting. I only knew her because I was on that museum board, and she knew a lot about Eiseley, and so we did have conversations about that sort of thing, and it was a delight to know her. The Friends of Loren Eiseley put on programs every year, of course, and many of them were in Morrill Hall, and a lot of them were out at the Bert Shellstrait residence up on North 14th Street. There were so many speakers that we had, and I just can't talk about all of them, but Peter Heitman was one that I was particularly impressed with. He was an English professor at Ohio State, and he wrote a book called which referred to Eiseley as the modern Ishmael. Then Kathleen Boardman was a graduate of our university, and she taught out at Reno, and she gave us a lot of material. And another fellow that I was particularly fond of was Paul Gruco. And of all of the people that ever spoke at an Eiseley meeting, I think Paul Gruco wrote more like Eiseley did than anybody else. Paul's book, The Necessity of Empty Places, is a delightful book. Paul mostly wrote about the border country in Minnesota between just under Canada. We also made presentations at the Nebraska Literature Festival. We had someone do something every time. Namely me, supported an Audubon seminar that happened at Love Library. This was something that was engineered by Jim Rosowski. The Rosowski name is known very well because of Sue, who is the Cather person. But Jim was my friend, and we put on a thing which was sponsored by the Friends of Loren Eiseley, among others, and it was the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the 1843 Audubon Missouri River Expedition. And it was interesting at that time, Johnny Johnson gave the library the quadrupeds of North America. And another thing had come to the library, which was the elephant folio of the birds of North America, which a farmer had found under his bed. It had been there for years, and he didn't even know it was there. And so the Audubon thing was really quite a major event. Another thing that was really exciting was a presentation by E.O. Wilson, whom you know is the Harvard professor that is so much involved. When he was scheduled for the Thompson lectures, it happens that Jack Thompson was a good friend of mine, and I asked Jack if it would be possible for Wilson to give a talk to us while he was in town. And so Jack looked into it, and I got support from 4 organizations. Eiseley didn't have any money, so I put up my own money, but Eiseley was a supporter of this thing. And Wilson spoke on global challenges to biodiversity. His speech that he gave for us was far more engaging than the one he gave to the Thompson lectures. Jack Thompson was so tickled with the way that all worked that he up and paid all the bills from the Cooper Foundation, and it didn't cost us anything. But the fact that I got to have lunch with E.O. Wilson was one of the great moments of my life. Then, of course, another thing that we did was we had tours. We developed a tour of the Eiseley sites, and there's a folder that that gives all of those directions. And we would take people around on these tours. Darrell Berg, at one point in time, took over that responsibility, and he developed that into a very fine thing. And there is a film of the tour as led by Darrell, and it is in the Heritage Room, and it could be seen. It could be shown. You could see it in the Heritage Room. But Darrell did a really good job with that. Of course, Darrell is one of our board members. Another program we had was scholarships. Bert Schultz was the big man with the Academy of Sciences, and he gave them a principal sum of money which would yield some interest, which we could use to give scholarships. And so the youngsters wrote essays, and the best essay got a scholarship. Another thing that we did was the university's honors course. That was done for several years. Mary Liz Jamison did that for several of the years. Depending on how that was conducted, several of us were invited in to be speakers, and that was a very successful thing. And then Chang and Berg, Darrell Berg and Ving did programs in Omaha, and I never got to see one of them, so I'm not quite sure how they were conducted, but they were popular. Naomi Brill was on the Humanities Speakers Bureau, and she made lots of presentations around the state. She drove out to different cities and talked. And then Chris Pappas and I did a thing on KZUM, which was a part of a series they were doing on Nebraska authors. Jerry Cox and her public school associates did a literary map of Nebraska. I wrote the Eiseley biography for that, for the little book that went with that map. And that was an interesting experience because there were very strict parameters that we had to follow. Of course, the number of words was one, but we had to emphasize the Nebraska relationship of the person we were talking about. And then I got a call from a woman at the University of Oklahoma at Stillwater. She was overseeing the production of the American section of a World Biographical Dictionary of Philosophy. And I wrote the Eiseley biography for that. This was published in England, but I never got to see one. Another thing that was published was The Sellers of Time. We were marginally involved with this. Mike Voorhees was on our board at that time, and he's the one that really pulled this off. He was the editor for it. The Sellers of Time is a beautiful thing about the fossil life, the prehistory of Nebraska, and Eiseley is represented in that through quotations and references. The next thing I'd like to do is describe what some of our big projects were. The first one wasn't so successful. We wanted to get Eiseley on a postage stamp. There's a series called Famous Americans, and it was mostly Bert Schultz. We actually went through all of the steps that you go through to get into this thing, and we got approval that Eiseley would be suitable for the series. But we never made it because the competition each year for the number of stamps that they issue is so intense that we never made the grade. But the other thing that was happening about that time was the idea of getting Eiseley into the Nebraska Hall of Fame. In the old days, the rules were that the party you were nominating had to be dead 10 years, and of course he had to be very much associated with Nebraska. You nominate, and then the committee decides. Well, we started out, we made our nomination, everything was great. We didn't seem to have any competition, and we were just sitting there waiting for the commission to meet so that we could claim our victory. And suddenly, out of the clear blue sky, Woody Varner came into the picture, and he nominated Darrell Zanuck. Now, Darrell Zanuck, as you may know, was a native of Wahoo. This nomination had the force of the university behind it, and it had the appearance that it was just going to completely wipe us out. And so we were pretty shook. And someone got to Bob Kerrey, who was the governor at that time, and I'm sure it was Bert, because Bert and Kerrey talked together all the time anyway. And Kerrey called Ron Roskins, who was the president of the university system at that time, and he told Ron in no uncertain terms to have the university withdraw their candidate. Both Ron and Kerrey were Eiseley fans, by the way. And by the way, I also want to say that Ron was my high school classmate. Well, we won. Now that we were winners, we had a real problem because we had to have a sculpture. We needed a sculpture to put in the Hall of Fame. Now, Cappy Wells, sculptor Cappy Wells, had done one for the University of Pennsylvania, and only one had been cast from that. And we discovered that that form was still in storage, and it was found to be damaged. But Cappy Wells was able to fix it, and so we got a bust. We got our bust, but the bust that we got would not suit the modern parameters. It's a beautiful piece of work. It's not the right size, and it doesn't meet things that the State House wants now. But we snuck in with that bust, and it's one of the best looking busts in the whole Hall of Fame. Now, one thing that was interesting. When Cappy Wells was the wife of John Stuart Mott, and that was the Motts were the heirs of General Motors money, and so that was pretty fancy people. When we were together at the governor's mansion after the induction to the Hall of Fame, Ruth asked everybody to go around and tell who they were, and John Stuart Mott stood up and he said, "I'm John Stuart Mott, and I deal in philanthropy." Well, the boulder, the sculpture was in the Hall of Fame, and then suddenly we had a problem. Bert Schultz had decided that the boulder should be mounted on one of the big boulders that comes down with the glaciers. And so he did that, and suddenly our beautiful sculpture was sitting on this stupid rock, and it looked ridiculous. And it took us a long time to get that sculpture off the rock, but we did. One of the things that happened during the Hall of Fame year was that we did a special issue of the Prairie Schooner. We put up some money so that we could have an enlarged printing of that thing so that we could distribute it to our members. This thing has since been republished by the University Press in recent years. But the thing was wonderful because a lot of the people that we're associated with had pieces in them. Howard Nemiroff was the leading person who wrote a beautiful essay for this purpose. And then Erlene Christensen, Gail Christensen, Fred Carlisle, Peter Hartman, Ben Howard, Catherine Workley, and Naomi Brill wrote essays, and all of those people were close associates with us in the early days of our organization. And of course, they were from different colleges and universities. Naomi was here. One of the things that I didn't do, which I'd like to do, is just read a little bit from the induction into the Hall of Fame that was written by Herb Hyde. And I'd like to just read a couple paragraphs. Secretary of State Alan Bierman was an excellent master of ceremonies who kept the program moving along at a steady pace from the presentation of colors by the UNLROTC to the unveiling of